Well, good evening and welcome to Rasha Christie South Africa and our weekly YouTube channel interviews with Christian scholars from all over the world. And yes, hopefully you can join us for another interesting lecture from one of our distinguished speakers. Rasha Christie is a student campus ministry based at 5 universities in South Africa: Rhodes, University of Pretoria, UKZN, NWU, and also Stellenbosch University. And so we connect with students on campus. We serve the students by introducing them to the discipline of Christian apologetics and help Christians to better understand the reasons for the Christian faith, so that they can have more confidence in their faith in the Christian worldview, and also better understand the worldviews of those around them who don't share the Christian worldview. And so we're there the students in a variety of ways by having clubs or clubs or chapters on the universities. We also have a website, so do avail yourself of that, rashachristie.co.za, where we've got a number of free articles and booklets which you can take advantage of, and a growing library of interviews with scholars, as I said, from all over the world on our YouTube channel as well. So do avail yourself of that. Well, we are very fortunate. In fact, we've been doubly fortunate because we've been successful in securing Dr. Paul Copan within less than a space of a year for 2 interviews. He kindly did an interview for us last year, and has offered to do another talk for us this evening. And so we are very excited about that. And so let me just say a little bit about Dr. Copan. Dr. Copan is professor of philosophy. He's based in Florida. He's been the president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, has published many books, but the one book that you really need to take a look at if you get a chance will be the one he's written on the subject of relativism, which we'll be discussing this evening. And so I've had the good fortune of knowing Dr. Copan, who is a really accomplished Christian scholar, a real inspirational example of what Christian can do when you love God with just your heart and mind. And so I do encourage you to take a look at his works. He's done a broad swathe of topics on controversial topics. He's done a lot of work as well, for interest's sake, on the issue of Canaanite, the problem of violence in the Old Testament with respect to the Canaanites. So you can go and look at some of the books he's done there. Is God a Moral Monster? That's another text as well to take a look at. But yes, that's some of the information about Dr. Copan. Dr. Copan, good evening and welcome to Rasha Christie, South Africa.
Good to be back with you, Simon. Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's excellent. Thank you once again so much for giving us an hour of your time. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, I assume I'll just plunge in and we'll get going if that's all right.
Yeah, if you can dive in with your share screen into your PowerPoint and then chip away at that. And when you're done, let's have a time for some Q&A.
All right, sounds good. Well, I'm glad to be with you all and talking about the topic of relativism. And as you can see from the book title there, True for You but Not for Me, I address a number of slogans that come out of a relativistic frame of mind. One of those categories has to do with tolerance. It's often assumed, a definition is assumed about accepting all beliefs as true. And as we'll see, that's a problematic definition. There's a good kind of tolerance and a bad and inconsistent kind of tolerance. So we'll talk about that in due course. But for starters, might be good to note what Pope John Paul said about relativism, and he talked about its dictatorship. There's a dictatorship of relativism in our culture. What seems to be so placid, so generous toward others turns out to be a deeply problematic stance, because many people who are relativists actually get very angry. They consider you as a Christian arrogant and judgmental, tolerant, and some people even dangerous. And so that is the kind of thing that we're up against as we interact with people who are coming from a relativistic worldview. That if you don't accommodate their relativism, if you don't buy into their relativism, then you are seen as a danger to them. You are seen as imperialistic and so forth. So let's unpack the direction in which we're going to be going here. Well, first of all, talk about truth and relativism, defining our terms, making sure that we're clear on that. And then how do we respond to relativism? And then thirdly, how do we respond to relativists, those who are propounding relativism? So that's our general breakdown. And again, happy to take your questions as we move forward in this conversation. Well, let's first talk about relativism and truth. When it comes to relativism, we think of our own relatives, people who are related to us. And when you think about truth, it's the concept that truth is relative, or perhaps even morality, is relative to an individual's perspective, culture, period in history, for example. So there is, you've probably heard the phrase, when in Rome, do as the Romans. You just accommodate to the way that they do things. No one's right or wrong. There's a song that kind of a Motown song that I heard growing up. There ain't no good guy, there ain't no bad guy. There's just you and me, and we just disagree. That's the kind of mindset. There's no good or bad. We just may not see things the same way, but that's okay. It's all relative. And of course, relative is opposed to that which is absolute or objectively or universally true. So when somebody says that's just true for you, but not for me, there is a strong resistance toward anything that sounds absolute. And of course, absolute can sometimes have a negative connotation in the sense that it suggests a certain attitude, maybe an arrogance and so forth. One can hold to the absoluteness of 2 + 2 = 4 without being arrogant and narrow-minded. That's just the way it is. 2 + 2 = 4. Just no other way to receive it, no other way to look at it. That's just it. But you don't be arrogant about it. So anyway, that's something to keep in mind, and we'll come back to that theme of person versus or belief versus attitude later on. In this perspective, truth is reduced to the level of opinion or mere belief. So you have your own preference of ice cream. That's your opinion, that's your belief. And you often hear people say, well, that's just your perspective. That's just your opinion. And so it's often reduced to this level. And if that's the case, then you have this notion of, as Christians, one of the problems is that we share a message of redemption, which requires repentance. And when we share our faith, a lot of people think, oh, that's arrogant, that's narrow-minded. You're saying that there is just one way to salvation. But also there's another implication here that if you are talking about redemption, it requires repentance. It requires recognizing that you have failed morally and spiritually, and that you need to acknowledge that and turn from that. And so relativism resists that idea that repentance is required. There is no standard. There is no more or less virtuous character. So anyway, in the relativist frame of mind, redemption is utterly irrelevant and perhaps simply offensive. And so that is the sort of thing that we're up against. Well, what about truth? Truth is basically a correspondence, a matchup of a statement, a story, a belief with reality. And if you think of a socket wrench that fits onto a bolt, if there's a good fit, there is a correspondence between them. So the analogy is between the belief and reality. There is a matchup between them. And so you may be fans of Wallace and Gromit here. They're the Grand Day Out, where Wallace, the inventor, tells his dog that the moon is made of cheese. Now, why is that a problem? Why is that false? Well, because it doesn't match up with the way things really are. The moon is not really made of cheese. And so if a belief or story or an idea doesn't match up with reality or the way things really are, then it is false. So if I say the earth is flat, well, it's out of sync with reality. So my statement would be in error. It would be false. So keep in mind that correspondence between the belief or the story and reality, the way things really are. And so this is the understanding of truth that is, I think, intuitively obvious to us, that the truth matches up with reality. If I tell you about something that doesn't match up with reality and I say this is true, then that's problematic. So reality confers truth. The actual world confers or grounds truth, and also you'd say, by virtue of diverging from it, falsity. A true statement is one that is faithful to reality. So reality is like, it's like betting on a horse. Not advocating this, but what actually makes my bet come off is that the horse that I'm betting on actually wins. It's not as though my bet makes the horse win or something like that. No, and likewise, reality makes my belief true. Reality is the truth maker. So let's keep going here. So having laid out our definitions of relativism, of truth, of that which is person or culture dependent, as opposed to that which is true, whether anybody believes it or not, or prefers it or not, we come to responding to relativism. So how do we respond to those who say, well, that's just true for you, but not for me? Often these are conversation stoppers for a lot of people. They don't know how to respond to that. So let's take a crack at that. We'll see, first of all, that relativism is self-refuting. In that relativists believe that their own view is absolutely true for everyone. And if you disagree with the relativist, you are in error. And also relativism is selective. You can't be a consistent relativist. That a certain structure of objective truth and morality is often necessary to prop up a selective relativism, because one can't be a thoroughgoing relativist. It simply will not practically work out, and of course it's logically self-refuting too. But here we go. Let's unpack these things. First of all, relativism as being self-refuting. As I've said, relativists are actually absolutists. And here are some of the things that relativists as absolutists believe. They believe that if you're not a relativist, then you're in error. Not hard to see that. Also, relativists will tell you that you shouldn't say that someone else is wrong. That's offensive, that's bad. Here's another absolute. All views are equally acceptable. And if you reject that viewpoint, then you are imperialistic or whatever. Here's another absolute rule. Here's, you shouldn't impose morality on others. Perhaps you've heard that before. Who made you the authority? Of course, you have to ask the question, well, where did that standard come from that you shouldn't impose morality on others? It presumes a moral standard itself. And if you're a relativist, well, where did that come from? Why think that that's absolute? Here are a few more. You ought to be tolerant. There's a moral obligation here. You ought to be tolerant. You shouldn't judge people. People don't like to be considered judgmental or judging others. Don't judge me. And well, what does that mean? It's good to get some definitions here, because people who use these terms of judge and tolerant and so forth, they will use them in a very inconsistent way typically in their favor, and they'll be happy to be intolerant or to judge other people for their viewpoints or their morality. There's another moral obligation. You ought to be open-minded. You ought to be open-minded. There's a moral obligation. Hey, that you ought to accept all beliefs as true. And of course, it's arrogant or bigoted or imperialistic to be ethnocentric. I was once at a school in Massachusetts, here in the United States, and I was speaking to someone. Actually, no, it was actually upstate New York, and I was doing an open forum. And there was a young lady who stood up, and she said, "You're being ethnocentric." And so I asked her what she meant, and I said, "Of course, if you believe that it's morally wrong to be ethnocentric, where did that moral standard come from?" And she said, "Well, you believe that your morality should be imposed on other people." So I asked her this question. I said, "Well, if you're walking down a dark alley and there's someone who's about to sexually assault you, but there is a bystander who'd be willing to help you, to protect you, to defend you, would you want that person to impose his morality on your attacker?" And she said, "You're distorting what I'm saying." I said, "No, I'm not distorting what you're saying. What I'm trying to do is show you that it's easy to talk about relativism being the case when it's out there not affecting me, but when somebody violates my rights, when somebody violates me, then I say that's wrong, you shouldn't do it, that's bad." But again, if you're a relativist, that's just what a person will do, and you can't say that that's wrong. Also, interestingly, relativists like to tack on absolutes to their relative statements. Have you ever noticed that? They can't leave things in a relativistic frame of mind. They've got to add something to curb an anything goes mindset. You can do whatever you want, just as long as you don't hurt anyone. Well, why not say you could do whatever you want? Or you can do whatever you want, just as long as it's between two consenting adults. Well, I thought everything's relative. Why tack that on? Why does it have to be between two consenting adults? Is that an absolute moral standard that you've got to follow? Again, relativists are very shaky and inconsistent about their assertions. So here we come to the comparison of really what we have is a kind of preference here. The notion of ice cream. And this is kind of we call this the ice cream dilemma, if you like. Ice cream flavor, that the relativists have this kind of dilemma. Their view is either trivial or self-contradictory. You see, if you believe that all people just have their own perspective and neither one is right or wrong, well, you're going to do one of two things. You'll either trivialize your own perspective. It's sort of like saying, "This is my favorite ice cream flavor." Well, big deal. You have your own favorite flavor, I have mine. I like Ben & Jerry's New York Super Fudge Chunk Ice Cream. So, but that's just my preference. So if you like another one, that's fine. That's just your perspective. But the person who believes that truth and morality are just a matter of perspective don't typically hold that viewpoint. They don't take that kind of a stance. What they do is they contradict themselves because they believe their perspective is universally true. And if you disagree with this perspective, then you are wrong. You're in error. The problem here is that the relativist is going to have to either relativize his own relativism or contradict his own relativism. That is, he's going to say, well, this is just my belief and it really doesn't matter what I think. Or he's going to contradict himself by saying all perspectives, everything is a matter of perspective, but if you disagree with that statement, then you are in error. So we have this dilemma. It's either trivial or self-contradictory. So when relativists say that all beliefs are a matter of perspective, we can say, is that just your perspective or is that true for all people? See, in this case, relativism relativizes itself. It can't stand up under its own scrutiny. Friedrich Nietzsche, again, he can be sometimes hard to interpret. Some people say he was nihilistic. Others say, no, he actually had a moral compass and so forth. I'm not going to get into that, but let's just take at face value the point that Friedrich Nietzsche says there are no facts, only interpretations. Well, if we take that at face value, he said, we can ask, is that a fact, or is that just one's interpretation? You say there are no facts. Well, is that a fact? If everything is a matter of interpretation, why take that interpretation any more seriously than the next one? Why should I listen or pay attention to someone else's interpretation if there is no such thing as objective truth? The philosopher Roger Scruton wrote, he says, a writer who says there are no truths or that all truth is merely relative is asking you not to believe him. So don't. I hope you catch what he's saying here. If everything's merely relative, it's like advertising, don't believe a word I say, because there is no such thing as truth. The Christian author, pastor Tim Keller writes, is there anyone in the world right now doing things you believe they should stop doing, no matter what they personally believe about the correctness of their behavior? Again, a very basic question. Are there some things that offend you, things that you believe are wrong, things that should be stopped? Well, if you're a relativist, what's the justification for trying to stop that person? I remember being living in Atlanta, and there was a student newspaper at Emory University called The Wheel, and there was someone who was complaining about those Christians out there who believed in morality, which he said is just merely subjective and personal. And he says they get very angry when people talk about things that are so personal and subjective, as though this is, true or right. And so I wrote a reply to this young man who is putting this out there, and I said, why should a relativist get angry at anything at all? It's just his own particular perspective, and you could expect people to disagree with you, but unless you believe that everything, that there is no truth, that there is no objective morality, if you really believe that there are no such things as truth or morality, then what's the issue of getting upset? It does suggest that you do hold to certain moral standards after all. Also, relativists misuse terms like tolerate and judge. You may have wondered, how do I respond to people who use that term tolerate or judge and put me on the spot? Well, here are a few things that might be helpful as you process this. For one thing, it's helpful just to ask them what they mean by a particular category, a particular term. How do you define tolerance? How do you define judging? So let's talk about tolerance. The true tolerance, the classical understanding of tolerance, is that you put up with what you take to be disagreeable or unpleasant or false. We tolerate people on airplanes, maybe they have body odor, or they're snoring while they're sleeping, or there's a baby crying. Well, you put up with those sorts of things. You put on your noise reducing headphones or whatever. You put cologne under your nose or whatever to, you make these modifications. You make those adjustments. You put up with what you find disagreeable or false. But today's understanding of tolerance is an inconsistent and false one. It basically takes the view that you have to accept all beliefs or perspectives as true or legitimate. And so not to accept another person's view as true is to be intolerant. So let's talk about this a little bit. There are three issues three problems with today's understanding of tolerance. First of all, there's this notion of negativity. True tolerance is negative, not positive. It assumes something negative. We tolerate things we don't like. We don't tolerate things that we celebrate. Now, we don't tolerate chocolate. I mean, you may have an allergic reaction to it, but those exceptions being set aside, we love chocolate. We love the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. And so tolerance, this false view of tolerance simply does not accept or tolerate views that it disagrees with. That it rejects it. So it's going to be inconsistent if you take the view that all things ought to be accepted as true. Well, you can't accept that very belief itself if you can't accept a belief that disagrees with your own. But true tolerance does recognize that there are beliefs that are different. You put up with them. You may not like them, but you put up with them. It's sort of like free speech. We may not like everything that we hear when it comes to people's viewpoints, but we allow people the right to think differently, to express themselves differently than we do. That's a value in society. Also, morality. Here's another implication. There is an implied moral standard, as we've seen, that it's immoral to be intolerant. It's immoral to impose your views on others. But you have to ask the question, well, where does this standard come from if all views are equally true? And then there's a notion of apathy. You see, people who are relativists come to this position not because they're necessarily, they thought through the implications of the issue, and have concluded rationally, logically, that relativism must be the case. Rather, relativism is often the easy way out. It's the anti-intellectual way out. So the notion of tolerance is often expression of moral apathy, not taking moral judgment seriously, not wrestling with, say, ethical dilemmas, or how do I make wise moral judgments in the face of these conflicting perspectives, or how do I make a wise moral judgment? Relativism throws all of that away. And of course, it throws away the possibility of becoming a person of good moral character, because there is no standard to which we ought to aspire. And this is what Dorothy Sayers herself has said about this notion of tolerance. She says, in the world it calls itself tolerance, but in hell it is called despair. It is the accomplice of the other sins and their worst punishment. It is the sin which believes nothing, cares for nothing, seeks to know nothing, interferes with nothing, enjoys nothing, loves nothing, hates nothing, finds purpose in nothing, lives for nothing, and only remains alive because there is nothing it would die for. Again, these are the sorts of issues that we're dealing with when we come to the topic of tolerance, this flawed, false view of tolerance. Let's talk a little bit about judging. What we mean by judging, look at Matthew 7:1, we'll come back to that in a moment, but the notion of feeling superior at the failure of others, that is what we call judgmentalism. I'm better than you. I am morally superior to you because you've done that and I haven't, or maybe I haven't done it as obviously as you have. So true judging, when it comes to the negative dimension, has that sense of judgmentalism, feeling morally superior at the failure of others. And of course, as Jesus says, don't judge lest you also be judged. And again, this text is one that relativists like to quote. They like to quote Jesus here. Of course, they're misusing what Jesus has to say here, but they're saying, don't judge or you too will be judged. Well, problem here is that this is a false understanding of what Jesus is saying. The contemporary definition of judging, that it's wrong to say that someone is in the wrong or acting immorally. But if you understand anything about Jesus, you know that Jesus did not mean that sort of a thing. He's often condemning behavior that is hypocritical. He's often speaking out against greed and so forth. Jesus does recognize that there's a problem that needs to be avoided, that there is a speck to be removed. And so Jesus is basically saying, like Mr. Garvey in that Key and Peele video, I'm for real. You better check yourself. So he's definitely highlighting the importance of this. Let me pause there. Sorry, keep it going there. I somehow paused my screen share. You tried to move that out of the way. Resume share. There we go. All right. So So you got Jesus is saying, take the plank out of your own eye first, and then you can take you can take the speck out of your brother's eye. There's a problem that needs to be addressed, but first check yourself. And this is what Jesus is saying. Check yourself first before you help your brother or sister who has a problem. There's a problem that needs to be addressed. But Jesus, interestingly, goes on to talk about those, he uses the term dogs and swines, those who are unworthy of our trust. It was commonly used of people in Rome in Jesus' day, people who were ruling from Rome. And in Jesus' day, they're called dogs and swine. And Jesus is using this terminology. Don't entrust yourself to people who are unworthy of your trust. Don't cast your pearls before swine. Don't give what is holy to the dogs. And this is in the context of trusting. Don't trust those who are, don't trust those who are promising you the world in politics and so forth. I mean, but keep that, keep it with a loose hand, because they can turn on you. And so Jesus says, don't cast your pearls before swine or give what is holy to the dogs, lest they turn against you and tear you to pieces. And so Jesus is just saying, he goes on to say, trust in your heavenly Father, ask, seek, and knock, trust in your heavenly Father. He is worthy of your trust, that he will give good gifts to those who ask him. Jesus also in Matthew 7 is talking about false prophets. He says, by their fruit, you will know them. He's talking about moral fruits, people who are saying one thing, but leading another kind of life. Look at the fruit of their lives. So there are judgments that we need to be making. Jesus in that same chapter speaks about those who are wise and foolish persons. The wise person is the one who says he believes but doesn't do anything about it. The wise person is the one who hears God's word, hears the words of Jesus, and actually does them. So some problems with this false definition of judging. It's of course inconsistent. People will judge another for judging. People say, who are you to judge someone? Well, what they're doing is they're judging you for judging someone else. That is because they're using the wrong understanding of judging. If you can't say anything wrong, if that's what judging is, you can't say, oh, you're wrong. Well, the person who is saying you can't say that, that person is by implication saying that you're wrong for saying that someone else is wrong. Also, and again, it assumes a moral standard, that it's morally wrong to judge. But where did that standard come from? Again, the relativist can't live consistently with his own relativism. And then finally, when it comes to the issue of truth or veracity, Jesus elsewhere calls for those who are making judgments to make a true or right judgment rather than judging by mere appearances. Jesus in John 7:24 says, don't judge by mere appearances, but make a right judgment. Let me say something about relativism and its selectivity. Relativism is selective. Here I've given a few examples of the selectivity of relativism, but people tend to be relativists when it comes to God or religion and ethics, but little else. And so I'll tell you a story about J.P. Moreland. He's a Christian philosopher, a friend of mine. So he's telling a story about being at the University of Vermont, and he was speaking in a dorm room. This back, I think, in the 70s. Was speaking in a student dorm at the University of Vermont, and was talking to a student afterwards, and the student was telling JP, he says, whatever is true for you is true for you. Whatever is true for me is true for me. We just shouldn't go around forcing our views on other people. Now notice that that moral standard being slipped in there. What's true for you is true for you. We just shouldn't go around forcing our views on other people. That is, it's morally wrong to force your views on other people. So J.P. Moreland, he heard this, and he actually found out where the student was and started to unplug, back in the day, his stereo system, started to unplug his, the receiver and the phonograph or whatever. And so he started to walk out of the room with it, and the student was baffled and dumbfounded. Here's this Christian philosopher taking my stereo. And he says, you can't do that. And JP says, what? You're not going to force your view on me that it's wrong to steal your stereo, are you? And interestingly, through this conversation, through this encounter, this student a couple of weeks later ended up becoming a Christian because he was confronted with the reality that human beings have dignity and worth. And J.P. Moreland told him, he says, you know, when it comes to sexual morality or cheating on exams and you say everything goes, it's all fine, it's all relative. But when somebody violates your rights or steals your property, then you say you can't do that. And so the student was arrested by this, and he became a Christian because he saw the connection between human dignity and worth and moral duties and the existence of a supremely valuable being, a God, whose good character informs our moral understanding. And so it could be a great new evangelistic method called stealing stereos for Jesus. I don't know, you could consider that perhaps in your own locale there in South Africa. Just kidding, just kidding. Here's some other things to consider. Relativists are absolutists when it comes to their rights or their property, as we've seen. And they also conveniently choose what is relative and what isn't. When it comes to sports scores, you know, or the stock market index, or labels on medicine bottles. You know, the relativist doesn't say, well, this is just true for the pharmacist, but not for me. The relativist doesn't say, oh, this is, you know, when it comes to Paris being the capital of France, it doesn't say that's just true, you know, Paris is in France, that's just true for the French, but not for me. No, of course not. The relativist is very selective about what he's relativistic about. So people tend to be relativists when it comes to a matter of God and ethics, when it's personally inconvenient for them. I think it's also important to consider motivations, not because motivations somehow disprove a position. You have to do that on other grounds. But it's worth considering what the relativist motivation may well be. John Searle, noted philosopher at the University of California at Berkeley, talked about this. He said that this view of relativism satisfies a basic urge to power. It seems too disgusting somehow that we should have to be at the mercy of the real world. We want to be in control. We want to have things work according to the way that we structure reality. But as it turns out, we find ourselves bumping into reality over and over again. People get sick and die. People, we run into traffic jams on the freeways. We find that there are people we would rather, be away from, but we have to work with them side by side in the work environment. There, we would like to control the way things work around us, but we find that we bump up against reality over and over again. But again, when people get rid of truth, then power ultimately becomes the only game in town. If truth is no longer objective, truth no longer matters, then whoever's carrying the biggest stick ends up being the winner. And relativism is an attempt to harness or constrain, have that power over the things that are around me. And so consider the motivation. It's not because people are not persuaded because of intellectual arguments that relativism is the case. Rather, it's because of their own personal preferences. This is what they want to be the case. Again, it doesn't disprove, but it's just a reminder that you can give all sorts of good arguments against relativism. But the problem is people aren't persuaded by the intellect in the first place to embrace relativism. It's just a default mode that is convenient, that is intellectually lazy. And so that's the default mode that many people go in because arguments are irrelevant. Reality is irrelevant insofar as they're concerned. So let's talk about some miscellaneous concerns here. So when it comes to these, when it comes to morality, relativism, as I said, presupposes a certain orderliness, a basic moral decency in society. That relativists can get away with things because they're kind of nibbling on truth and morality around the edges, but they're counting on a fundamentally sound structure to society to sustain them in their relativism. You don't have the luxury of being a relativist in societies ruled by the Nazis or the Taliban. You've got to make a choice. You've got to take a stand. And so in Western democracies, yeah, it's easy to get away with being a relativist, not a consistent one, but again, you can be selective in your relativism and get away with some of those things. Also, keep this in mind too. If you're a relativist, forget social justice issues. There is no issue of social justice at all. So you may talk about, well, maybe, advocating for, a trans position, defending the idea that, of transsexuality, that you can simply, because you feel like it, be a male or a female. You want to defend their rights. Well, if you're a relativist, there's no point to it. That's just that person's preference. You have your own preference. There's nothing to get into a social justice cause or crusade, against one position or for another. I remember I was speaking at a school in Georgia, in the United States, not the former Soviet Union, and I was speaking on this topic of relativism, and some of the students said to me, there is a Christian group, and they said, what should we entitle your talk? And I said, well, if I'm speaking on relativism, this might be something that gets people's attention. How about when racism and bigotry are okay? And some people said, okay, we'll try it. And so they submitted it to the school newspaper, and a lot of people were offended by this. They said, no, we can't allow this. And of course, the argument. And thankfully, there is a Christian editor who worked at the student newspaper, and she said, don't you get it? If everything is relative, then why say that racism is wrong? Why say that bigotry is wrong? There is nothing that is ultimately wrong. So they let it go. And we had a very good conversation about it at that university. Here's another point, reality. Why not simply prefer as one's truth or reality that AIDS, torture, rape, famine, and so forth are just true for others, but not for me? Why can't I just keep a detached perspective on these things rather than assuming that this is a reality, that we need to fight, certain things that we ought to fight against, certain things that we ought to stop, etc. Well, if you're just keeping it as your truth, why bother getting involved? It's very easy to become passive and detached if everything is just true for me, but not for you, and therefore this is your reality and not someone else's. Also, when it comes to sanity, if you're a relativist, then you can't distinguish between delusion and sanity. Think about it. The person who is in a psychiatric ward, is that just true for him, his perspective, but no one else? Well, no, we recognize when people are so far removed from the way things really are, they're detached from truth and reality. We have institutions for them to help them deal with this disconnect between their own minds and reality. But if you're a relativist, there is ultimately no difference between delusion and sanity. Also, veracity. There's no such thing as lying if truth is relative, or what we construct it to be. Why get upset with politicians who lie and so forth? Isn't that just true for them, but not for others? The very fact that we get upset is an indication that there is a moral standard being violated. People are not living in conformity to what is true. Also, there's a certain inescapability to truth. If you say that there is no such thing as truth, then you're actually admitting that truth exists. You're saying that it's true that there is no truth. In fact, relativists will often give arguments for why relativism is true, but in doing so, they're assuming the objectivity of reason, rules of logic, and so forth. These are something that we ought to embrace. That's what the relativist is assuming when defending his case. Right, briefly, let me just say a few things about responding to relativists, and then we'll jump into the Q&A time here. First of all, as we interact with relativists, it's just important to get to know relativists. Relativists are people who have disappointment in relationships, disappointment with authority, and we also ought to give people the opportunity to process the Christian faith. Give them time to think it through. There's a book that was published that deals with really it kind of tells the story of relativists or postmoderns who have to cross certain thresholds before they actually come to faith in Jesus Christ. That certain things need to happen if they believe that there's no such thing as truth or they're suspicious of truth. They have to cross certain thresholds. And the first one, these authors write, they're campus ministers with InterVarsity, but they noticed that people who made this pilgrimage from postmodernism, from relativism to belief in Jesus, the first hurdle that they had to overcome was that they had to move from distrust to trust. Moving from distrust to trust. That is, they needed to see in another person, in a relationship, that this person was trustworthy. Because after all, think about how relativists have been disappointed with authority. Their authorities have not been trustworthy. So they're skeptical, they're critical of anything that says this is authoritative, this is the way things are. You perhaps have seen a bumper sticker, we have it here in the States. It says, question authority. Now, of course, you have to ask the question, well, what's the authority behind the statement saying question authority? There's a presumed authority already there. It's sort of like saying, don't believe a word that I'm saying. But keeping that in mind as we relate to relativists and postmoderns, as we build a relationship with them, they see that there is a trustworthy person, a faithful person, a reliable person that enables them to take the next step to move toward a Jesus who is the ultimate authority, the one who calls us to submit to him. But first they need to see it realized in their own relationships. Moving from distrust to trust, that we're, as some people have said, the fifth gospel. There are 4 canonical gospels, but we're the 5th gospel, so that unbelievers will begin to read the 4 canonical gospels after they've seen the reality of the gospel in our own lives. Also, another thing to keep in mind is be careful about debate. Don't get into debates with relativists. I mean, even though relativism can be easily dismantled, that people are relativists for non-rational reasons, as I've said. And so even if you win a debate, so to speak, they may just shrug their shoulders and say, whatever. So dialogue rather than debate, and speak the truth in love, as Ephesians 4:15 says. Also, here are a couple of points of differentiation. Make 2 distinctions here. First, truth versus attitude. You can speak the truth, but sometimes people can speak the truth with an attitude that sounds arrogant or disagreeable. But as I said before, holding to the truth doesn't mean that you are arrogant or disagreeable necessarily. You can be, but don't let that be the case. And then secondly, distinguish between person and belief. You see, we respect persons without accepting or even respecting their beliefs. There are plenty of beliefs that are not worthy of respect. The notion of relativism itself is problematic and not worthy of respect because it's inconsistent. It's a self-contradictory belief system, so you can't even embrace it. Or the notion of adultery. A person who believes that adultery is okay will say, I can honor you as a person, but I reject the idea that that adultery is morally appropriate or permissible. So again, the problem with the relativist is the relativist collapses the two. Now, if you don't like my beliefs, you don't like me. And we need to communicate that there is a difference between the two, that you can agree to disagree. You can reject a certain person's beliefs, but you can say, but we can still be friends. We can still have a conversation. So the key is here to be an egalitarian when it comes to persons, but an elitist when it comes to beliefs or to truth. There are some viewpoints that ought to be rejected. In fact, the relativist rejects the viewpoint of the absolutist or the objectivist, the person who believes that there are certain things that really are true or really are right or wrong. So we can be an egalitarian when it comes to relating to persons, but we recognize that we cannot accept all beliefs as true. For example, if you're a Buddhist and another person's a Christian, you can't say, let's just accept each other's views as true. Well, the Buddhist doesn't believe in God. The Christian does. You can't accept both of them without embracing contradiction. And what does that even mean, to accept these views as true? Truth becomes nonsensical. As I said, relativists probably haven't been exposed to trustworthy authorities, and they haven't arrived at their conclusions based on logic, but personal preference. And so relativists need to learn to move from distrust to trust through relationship. Well, let me pause there, stop there, and we'll move on to whatever questions you all may have, and happy to entertain them at this time.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Copan, for that excellent presentation on relativism. Very helpful. Got some questions here. The first two questions are going to be historical. Is it fair to say that the early, in the pre-Socratics, the Sophists, would they have been philosophical relativists as well? Would you consider them to have had a relativistic philosophy?
Well, the sophists or the sophists did hold to a kind of a rhetoric, kind of a rhetorical approach to persuasion, rather than taking a viewpoint that is true, that is rooted in reality, is a matter of persuading people using rhetorical devices to, for them to embrace for the audience to embrace a certain viewpoint, regardless of the truth of it. So it happened to be whatever is the preferred viewpoint of the arguer, just using rhetorical devices to persuade a person to embrace that view. Now, you do have you have one, in Plato's writings, you have those like Protagoras talking about the notion of relativism, that what appears to be the case for you is true for you, and whatever appears to be the case for another person is true for that person. So you do have a kind of relativism that does emerge in the ancient world, but strictly speaking, the sophists are, they are relativistic in the sense that they are adopting one viewpoint over another, but they're using they're using rhetoric to persuade people. I think that that's their distinctive stamp. I wouldn't say that their distinctive stamp is relativism, although they certainly would reflect that kind of an attitude. But I'm kind of arguing for, I'm pointing to their kind of their mode of operation as they're speaking to audiences, that logic is not really all that important in what they're trying to do in their methodology. But you could say that they could be, you could connect them to relativism, although they've just got a different agenda.
Yes. Okay. The next question I would have for you then is related to, given the pervasiveness of relativism through the culture and the fact that this philosophy continues to prevail at many of our universities, how did we end up here? How did we get, where did this philosophy ultimately come from? Like, what are some of the basic ideas that this thing has become so entrenched in society? What led to this kind of upside down kind of thinking?
Yeah, well, there's several trajectories here, and I'll give a few of them. In the first instance, I would say that one philosopher, Johann von Herder, he said that cultures, again in the 18th century, that cultures are relative, that what one person takes to be true of one culture isn't necessarily the case about what is true in another culture. That gave some traction to this notion of a cultural relativism. Also, certain themes contributing to a relativism is that in the West is the age of exploration. In the 17th, 18th centuries, came forth. People realized, people practice things differently than what we do here in the West, and they recognized that there are simple differences, of belief, of morality in some cases. And so they took this as being an impetus for recognizing, well, maybe we're not a superior civilization after all. Maybe it's all a matter of kind of a certain cultural distribution of beliefs and moral practices, and that's all there is to it. You also have someone like Immanuel Kant, who believed in objective morality, believed in objective truth. But one of the problems with his viewpoint is that he distinguished between the world that is real in and of itself, the noumenal world, things as they are, as opposed to the phenomenal world, which is things as they appear to us. And Kant thought that the noumenal realm, the realm that is reality itself, and there's some interpretations on that too, I won't get into, but if you can't have access to reality itself, but all you have are appearances, then how can you actually say that I know what is real? My beliefs correspond to reality. You're simply, in a sense, stuck in your own mind, and you can't say this is right, this is wrong. You can simply talk about the way things appear to you. And so, even though Kant did not intend it, this notion of the way things are, reality, as opposed to the way things appear to us, my perspective, my interpretation, and so forth, this got traction and was picked up on by many people along the way. We also have what's called postmodernism, which reacted to modernism. And modernism was basically, to put it in a nutshell, the notion that human beings can have truth and goodness and beauty and human dignity and so forth, apart from belief in God. Of course, prior to that, in what we call the pre-modern era, there was a connection between truth, goodness, and beauty, and human dignity and rights and so forth, and the existence of God. But with, say, Rene Descartes, he died in 1650, I think, therefore I am. God is decentered from the human, path to knowledge, and then the individual knower displaces God as the starting point for knowledge. And so this spawned all sorts of isms of modernity, whether it be scientism or rationalism or romanticism, feelings as being the ultimate, or Marxism or Nazism or something like that. These eventually came to be these attempts to grasp goodness and truth and beauty apart from God, ended up crumbling into a great dismay that, when you have in the 20th century, the concentration camps, the labor camps of the Soviet Union, these being revealing, as postmoderns would say, that this shows the failure of these modernist projects. And therefore, not just get rid of God, but get rid of any sort of objective moral values, any sort of notion of universal standards. Those are also gone. And so we're left in this morass of everyone's own individual perspective. There is no meta narrative, no big picture. It's all a matter of a mini narrative, your own story, your own perspective, and you just have a plurality of them, which is, of course, its own meta narrative. But that's kind of a rough sketch of some of these inputs into how we've gotten to where we are in this day and age.
Yes, then one of the questions that's just come up here from our audience is tied to the conclusion of that response there of yours. Here's the question: do absolute truths necessarily lead to totalitarianism? When people claim they have an absolute, they seek to wipe out that which isn't. And so this is often thrown out there for people who are making absolute claims. You're dangerous. When people start to be that arrogant, it leads to totalitarianism and Nazis and all the rest of it. That's kind of the reaction to the modernist movement. How would you respond to that?
Sure. I think that when you look at someone like Jesus, who does make certain unique claims about himself, but he also says that all are welcome. He opens up the invitation of salvation to all, that God is calling, as Paul says in Athens, pagan Athens, in Acts 17, that God is calling all people everywhere to repent. That God is the one who desires the salvation of all people. that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all come to repentance. And that is indeed the call that we issue as Christians, that we say, it is open to anyone who would, submit to Jesus. So it doesn't have to lead to oppression, but there certainly are choices that we make, and we will find ourselves landing. We will have to embrace one kind of objective or absolutist stance or another. People who are postmoderns, it's not as though they somehow are in the clear because they are, they don't embrace a meta-narrative. They have their own meta-narrative, which is basically the notion that, everyone has his own individual perspective. There is a plurality of beliefs and so forth. But they reject this notion that there is one overarching story that has explanatory power to explain the way things are, that there is a trajectory of history, that there is a beginning point, where the universe come from, where is history heading, and so forth. So they will have to take a stance on something. Taking a stance is unavoidable. And so the question is, whether the postmodern rejects the Christian viewpoint, the gospel, which is itself a meta-narratival stance, just as the postmoderns is. So why does the postmodern think he is in this position of privilege that, I don't embrace the meta-narrative, therefore I'm not like you who do? No, everyone holds to a meta-narrative stance, and they will take a view of reality to be the case. And if you disagree with the postmodern, you would be in error. So again, truth and falsehood are inescapable. If you think that someone else is wrong and that your perspective is right, that person is in error and you are not, well, you've got a fundamental absolutist position here. So again, you cannot escape truth and falsehood. This binary is inescapable.
Yes, that's why I think that statement by the Pope about the dictatorship of relativism is because the very thing they accuse of everybody else being guilty of, well, they've kind of ushered in their own kind of totalitarian state of affairs with their lack of tolerance. Although it's funny, on the front end, they seem to be open to all, but they're very exclusive in their own claims. And it's just that you got to point out this hypocrisy on their part at some level, in terms of the views.
It's interesting. Just even when it comes to Islam, for example, in Western Europe, for example, Islam often gets a pass on when it comes to issues of, they can say whatever they want, but when Christians speak out against them, then that is blockaded. That is seen as hate speech and so forth. So again, there are these inconsistencies that come up. Multiculturalism in Europe and other parts of the world, again, leads to that kind of, there's that hypocrisy. The Christian faith often gets singled out for blame, but anything else goes. I mean, J.P. Moreland I heard him say this. He said, the only heresy on university campuses today is Orthodox Christianity. Yes,
no, and that's certainly true, and we find the same here in South Africa, in many places as well. I want to roll this forward now because I've known you for a few years, and we've been addressing relativism when I was living in the States, and addressing relativism here in South Africa. It's pretty much a lot of young people that subscribe to this philosophy, whether they do that consciously or whether it's just, as it often is, through the mood or the culture, just kind of, you just marinate in this, and this just shapes how you think. But talk to me a little bit about the relationship between this philosophy and the social justice movement. Because you mentioned earlier on in your lecture there that there's a relationship between this philosophy and some aspects of, what's true for me is I think I'm this kind of a person, and that's my truth. Who says so? I say so. So if I'm a guy and I want to, I self-identify as a woman and compete in women's athletics, then who are you to say? Who are you to judge? But perhaps you can talk about some of your expertise on this philosophy of relativism and things like we see in the social justice movement.
Yeah, again, this movement tends to, like I said, any sort of a standard that has been held that is often associated with the Christian faith is inherently suspect. And so anything that is like, we talk about, God making human beings male and female in the beginning. Well, I mean, feminists for a long time were talking about what is distinctively feminine, what is distinctively, women's athletics, team sports, women, female equality. Well, even in the whole LGBTQ thing, this category. You have the T's that are often pitted against the L's. There is no longer any sort of a female category to, we're lesbians. Well, big deal. What does the body matter? It's what you feel inside. And so what ends up happening is that feelings end up displacing certain biological realities. And there's an ideology that is driving this that goes far beyond any sort of scientific justification. Okay, people feel a certain way. Here's an example. A friend of mine, Frank Beckwith, told me about this. He talked about, there's this episode on ER, emergency room. I haven't seen it. He just told me about it. He uses it in one of his classes, and he shows a man coming into a doctor's office, perfectly healthy specimen of humanity, walks into the doctor's office. The doctor says, "What can I do for you?" The man says, "I'd like to have one of my legs amputated." He said, "Well, why would you do that?" "Well, because I'm a one-legged man inside of a two-legged man's body." Well, if it's what you feel, you can do, why not amputate your leg? It's interesting that people wouldn't do that with an eye, they wouldn't do it with a hand, they wouldn't do it with a leg. But when it comes to the sexual organs, all of a sudden anything goes. You can identify whatever, regardless of the way that you came into the world sexually. And it's important for us to remember that the New Atlantis journal did a study a few years back on, out of Johns Hopkins University, studying those who were wanted to have sex reassignment surgery, those who identified as opposite of how they were born, and there is just no scientific evidence to justify this. There's nothing in terms of genetics, nothing in terms of brain makeup that determines these sorts of things. It is a lot of times social pressure, ideology, and so forth. And when you have this kind, when it comes to the trans community, there's such an early insistence on puberty blockers and so forth. You think, oh, maybe I am the opposite. Maybe I'm a guy rather than a girl after all. And so they start to do radical things to their own bodies. Whereas there's still a lot of sexual development, fluidity, and so forth that are often, again, this is being imposed upon the very youngest. And a lot of times parents aren't even told about what is going on. There are all sorts of cases that we can talk about where parents aren't told about what school counselors or administrators or teachers are even speaking about in the classroom. They're told to be quiet about this, not to tell their parents about it, because and so there is this detaching. There's a lot of social pressure that is coming into this. But again, what ends up happening is, some people say, well, look at the successes. Well, you have a high suicide rate amongst those who are in the trans community who have gone through sex reassignment surgery. What would have been relatively rare, often consigned to young boys between 2 and 4, and it was 0.06% of the population. Now it's starting to explode, not because of some sort of the way that you're born or some sort of a sexual identity. So we can, but there's a 41% higher suicide rate when you have sex reassignment surgery than the general population's suicide rate. And when you have that higher rate, we have to slow things down and say, hold on, let's not push the ideology. Let's actually try to help people. Is the problem with the body? or is the problem with the soul?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say, does the soul's issues need to be addressed? Do the soul's issues need to be addressed rather than going to something radical? And when you look at people who are going through these sorts of questions, a lot of times there is sexual abuse and associated with them. There's also a lot of cultural experimentation and pressure and so forth that goes into this as well. So rather than thinking this is a fixed part of my identity, there are other issues that also need to be brought into the picture. And simply, if you go to the extreme, having sex reassignment surgery isn't going to be the solution, because you can have a successful surgery, but that still doesn't address the psychological issues that need to be undertaken. There's a lot more beneath the surface. And so we ought to take as a starting point, how did I come into this world? What does my body look like? What is it, what about the X and XY chromosomes? Should this not inform something about a baseline, a starting point, before I get into these gender identity sorts of issues? Furthermore, you don't have female sports anymore in a lot of places because obviously men are different from women. Their muscle mass is develops at twice the rate as females, but yet they're to insist that they ought to be allowed to compete in female sports. Again, the L in the LGBT is being diminished. The feminine, the female side is being excluded. So the T community really is fundamentally obliterating the L, or the female dimension, because that doesn't matter anymore. Women's rights, big deal. It's all a matter of what you feel inside. And so these distinctions no longer hold. And again, these are ideologically driven, not scientifically driven. And we ought to push back and restraint rather than simply going ahead and saying, oh, whatever you feel is most important. And there's another problem here too, that you actually, what is the meta narrative? What is the metaphysical picture in the first place that justifies insisting on rights and your value and so forth? Why does anything count as a right if there is no God, if we don't have human dignity and worth? That is, where does that come from? If we're made in the image of God, hold on, we've got a theological perspective here. But if we're simply insisting on rights and dignity, and we simply come from the slime, why I think that value should come out of valueless processes? Why I think that rationality should come out of non-rational processes? Why I think that consciousness should come out of non-conscious processes? If God exists, makes sense of all of these things, but it also means that you can't simply do everything you want. There are certain structures to reality. And if we go outside of those bounds, then we're bound to bring harm to ourselves. I did a PragerU video called True for You, but Not for Me. And it's just a 5-minute clip. And I mentioned this Dutchman who at the age of 69 said he wanted to have his birth certificate changed because he felt like he was 49 years of age. And thankfully, the judge said, no, you really are 69 years of age. You've lived this long, and you can't change your birth certificate. You can't change reality simply because of the way that you feel. And so often I think this is kind of a metaphor for how much of society operates these days, that it's highly ideological, that it's rooted in the way that I feel, but there is no objectivity to it. Why should we prefer your viewpoint over anybody else's? It's just a matter of your own preference. Why do you insist on your own rights? And what about all those women who are what about their rights in female sports? Did they not get a voice in all of this?
No, for sure. And just to share some experience with you, here in South Africa, we're facing exactly the same issues that you are dealing with in the US, and seems to be the case that it's the same ideology driving things in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, many Western nations. They're dealing with the same thing, that there's an ideology going on here. This doesn't really have much to do with anatomy and physiology, but basically, at some level, this philosophy has taken a grip of young people, led by a bunch of elites, many of whom have come out of our universities, and they're persuading these young people that, what is true is whatever you think is the case. I mean, I remember seeing the shift in the discussions over homosexuality. Years ago, the argument was, I was just born this way.
Right.
Well, those people have been kicked to the curb now for making such a statement, because now Judith Butler is running the show, and her definition of sex holds she has the microphone, and so sex is now a social construct, gender performativity and that. And so now there's this new understanding of sexuality. And so we're also seeing these ballooning statistics here in South Africa of people just, showing up and saying, well, I think I'm a girl today when they're clearly a guy. We're seeing it here, and it's a philosophical thing. It's an ideological thing that's going on here. It's got nothing to do with anatomy and physiology. So because I know we were out of time now, but maybe one final question then. What would you say to young people who listen to this talk then, on how should we think about reality in the world, and what kind of philosophy should we be pursuing? You mentioned things corresponding with truth. Maybe you can conclude and just how we as young people should think about these things and issues as we seek to understand the world around us and connect with the world. What should our philosophy be about?
Yeah, no, a great question to end with, and I would say that it really is connected to what is the story of reality. You need to be able to answer that question. What is the story of reality? If we are the products of blind, deterministic, valueless, non-conscious, non-rational forces, why think that anything matters here? It's all a matter of power. It's not a matter of truth. It's not a matter of right and wrong. It's fundamentally whoever carries the biggest stick ends up winning. But if you believe in things like social justice, if you believe in human dignity and human rights, well, I've got a worldview for you that wonderfully makes sense of those things: moral duties, human dignity. We've been made in the image of God, that there is a purpose to life, that life has meaning by virtue of our being connected to the author of this world, the creator of the universe, and a God who loves us, a God who accepts us by, because he's made us in his image, that there is dignity and worth already there, and that I don't have to identify along certain lines in order to find where I belong. If there is a God who exists, he knows you, he loves you, he is concerned about you, he has a purpose for you. If it's all a matter of chance events having produced us, we don't really have any sort of dignity. Why should I insist on rights when rights are just a social construct? But if you really do believe that there are rights that ought to be for, not just for myself, but for everyone, then this presupposes a kind of worldview that borrows heavily from a biblical theism. It's borrowing from the heritage that we've often taken for granted and have even, as you've said, kicked to the curb. But it is actually the one that has brought us democracy. It has brought us these freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, that crimes against humanity. And I do presentations on these sorts of things where even naturalistic, atheistic thinkers recognize that the Christian, the biblical faith, has actually shaped our institutions of democracy, of equality before the law, of the notion of crimes against humanity, and so forth. These are not the result of secular developments. It is rooted in the biblical revelation, and when people faithfully carry out the biblical understanding of their relationship with Christ, they're carrying that worldview forward. They're living out their beliefs. Communities start to change. People, rights start to become a part of the pattern, equality before the law and so forth. So that's really the heritage we often neglected. And I'd say we need to get back to those roots, that it can actually speak to a lot of our impulses in our own day of, rights, democracy, freedom, and so forth. But if it's a freedom that's detached from our roots, then we're going to have all sorts of cultural confusion like we're experiencing in our day.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Copan, and thank you for once again lending us your time. We will probably in the future be pestering you again, because you've just mentioned some topics there which we would also like to hear you on the influence of the Christian worldview on society and institutions, and many other topics. But thank you once again for giving us some of your time on a Friday. God bless you, and keep up all of the excellent work, and send our love to all of the brothers and sisters in the States. And once again, we do really appreciate you giving us your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Appreciate it, Simon.